deep beneath the hills of central Italy, at a place now called Cerveteri. Narrow stone streets run between rows of round houses cut directly into rock, complete with doorways, roof beams and hearths, except that no one has lived in them for more than 2,000 years, because this is a city built entirely for the dead. Not far away, at Tarquinia, painted chambers still glow with banqueters reclining under painted vines, musicians playing double pipes, and dancers frozen mid-step. Images made by people whose names we mostly cannot recover, and whose spoken language today almost no one can fully read. Rome, the city that eventually swallowed all of this, is remembered by nearly everyone on Earth. The civilization that helped teach Rome how to be a city in the first place is remembered by comparatively few. Centuries before Rome ruled the Mediterranean, the people we call the Etruscans controlled some of the wealthiest and most sophisticated urban centers in Italy. Cities with planned streets, massive temples, skilled metalworkers, their own writing system, and burial grounds vast enough to be called cities of their own. To understand how a civilization powerful enough to shape early Rome ended up absorbed inside it, the story cannot begin with a legendary king or a foundation myth. It has to begin centuries earlier, in small farming settlements that had not yet become anything anyone would call Etruscan at all. In the centuries after 900 before the Common Era, the landscape of central Italy was dotted with modest villages, most of them built on easily defended hills and ridges above rivers and coastal plains. There was no single capital, no unified state, and no moment when a whole population simply woke up and declared themselves a new civilization. These communities, which archaeologists label Villanovan, after a cemetery site where their distinctive remains were first identified, cremated their dead and placed the ashes inside biconical clay urns, often accompanied by simple personal belongings, a bracelet, a pin, a small tool. Over successive generations, those grave goods grew steadily richer, a quiet signal, preserved in the ground long before any written record, that these societies were changing. As farming and metalworking expanded and population grew more settled, small hilltop villages began drawing closer together. And by the 8th century, before the Common Era, many of them were merging into larger, denser settlements at the very locations that would later become Etruscan cities. This process of consolidation, not any single dramatic arrival, was the true beginning of Etruscan civilization. At the same time, the wider Mediterranean world was reaching toward Italy's shores. Traders sailing from the Aegean and the Levant were drawn by the region's metal ores and fertile land, and foreign goods and techniques began filtering into local workshops, a preview of the transformation still to come. Ancient writers themselves debated where these people had come from, with one tradition claiming an origin in Lydia, in Anatolia, and other observers insisting they had always been native to Italy. Modern archaeology shows strong continuity, running directly from the Villanovan communities into later Etruscan culture. And ancient DNA studies published in recent years have found no clear sign of a late wave of Anatolian ancestry, arriving around the time this civilization took shape. The more revealing story, then, is not about a migration, but about transformation, ordinary agricultural communities growing larger, richer, and more organized until something recognizably new began to take form on the same hills their ancestors had always occupied. That transformation accelerated once wealth from the wider Mediterranean began arriving in earnest. Etruria sat on some of the richest metal deposits in Italy, iron, copper, and other ores that could be mined, smelted, and shipped to a Mediterranean world hungry for raw materials, and its fertile valleys and forests supplied grain, timber, and livestock in equal abundance. Convoys of ore moved down from inland mines toward the coast, where merchant ships waited offshore, and cargoes of amphorae, ivory, amber, and finely worked. Gold began crossing the docks in growing quantities. This exchange connected the emerging towns of central Italy to Greek city-states, to Phoenician trading networks, and to the wider Eastern Mediterranean. And the wealth it generated required a different kind of society to manage it, one capable of organizing labor, controlling farmland, defending territory, and directing long-distance trade at a scale no single village could sustain alone. Out of this pressure, true cities emerged. Places such as Veii, Caere, Tarquinia, Vulci, and Clusium grew into powerful urban centers, each governing its own territory. And later tradition remembered a loose association of roughly a dozen such city-states, bound together by shared language, religion, and culture, rather than by any single ruler or capital. This was a civilization built on cities without an empire, a structure that would prove both a source of vitality and, much later, a fatal vulnerability. Alongside this urban growth came writing. Around 700, before the Common Era, the first Etruscan inscriptions appear, using an alphabet adapted from Greek settlers in Italy, giving these communities a new tool for marking ownership, recording dedications to the gods, and asserting identity. Contrary to popular imagination, the Etruscan alphabet itself is not some unreadable code. Scholars can sound out and read most Etruscan letters without difficulty. The real barrier is that the language itself belongs to no known family related to Latin or Greek. And because most surviving inscriptions are short funerary or dedicatory texts, only a portion of Etruscan vocabulary and grammar can be confidently reconstructed, leaving whatever literature this civilization once possessed largely lost to us. Wealth, meanwhile, was reshaping status itself. Elite families began constructing enormous chamber tombs, cut into rock or raised as earthen mounds, turning burial grounds into permanent monuments to family identity and religious belief. At Cerveteri, these tombs would eventually be arranged along planned streets and small squares, forming something remarkably close to a city plan built entirely for the dead, while at Tarquinia, hundreds of painted chambers preserved scenes of feasting, music, and ritual for future centuries to uncover. Foreign influence poured into this world without erasing it. Greek pottery, Near Eastern imagery, and imported luxury goods filled elite households and workshops, and artisans absorbed these outside styles into something distinctly their own, rather than simply copying them. A goldsmith might have handled ivory from across the sea, and amber carried down from the north in the same afternoon, shaping them into ornaments no Greek or Phoenician workshop would have produced in quite the same way. Funerary art from this period also shows elite women appearing prominently in banquet and social scenes, a level of public visibility that struck outside observers as distinctive, even if it should not be read as evidence of equality by modern standards. Mineral wealth had produced trade, trade had produced elite fortunes, and those fortunes now funded temples, workshops, and monumental tombs across the region. By the close of this period, scattered Iron Age villages had become something new, an urban, literate, cosmopolitan civilization ready to project its wealth and ambition far beyond its own hillsides. By the 6th century before the Common Era, that ambition had turned into genuine regional power. Etruscan cities had grown wealthy enough to fund monumental architecture, temples raised on tall platforms and crowned with brightly painted terracotta figures looking down over crowded streets, while skilled bronze workers and painters produced objects and images admired far beyond Etruria's borders. Etruscan influence and settlement now stretched from the Tuscan and Latian heartland northward into the Po Valley, and southward into Campania. The widest reach this civilization would ever achieve, but it remained a network of independent, ambitious cities, rather than a single centralized state, a structural weakness quietly built into the very shape of its success. Rome itself, just south of the Etruscan heartland and sitting astride the Tiber trade corridor, felt this influence directly. Later Roman tradition remembered a period of Etruscan kings ruling the city in the late 7th and 6th centuries. And archaeology confirms that Rome grew rapidly during this era, developing stone construction and organized drainage of its low ground into what would become the Forum. Transformations that scholars closely associate with Etruscan urban expertise, arriving at Rome's doorstep. This tradition should be treated with some caution, since much of what later Roman writers recorded about their own early kings was set down centuries afterward. But the underlying pattern is clear enough. Early Rome was not yet a rival to its Etruscan neighbors. It was, for a time, effectively inside their cultural orbit. Prosperity, meanwhile, was reshaping daily and religious life across Etruria. Painted tombs from this era, especially the extraordinary series at Tarquinia, preserve banquets, athletic games, music, dance, and funerary ritual in vivid color, offering a rare window into how Etruscan elites imagined both this life and the next, even if these images capture aristocratic ideals rather than the experience of every farmer or laborer. But the very success that built temples and filled harbors with imported Greek pottery also multiplied Etruria's rivals. Expanding trade routes brought Etruscan interests into direct competition with Greek colonies and other maritime powers across the western Mediterranean. And control over ports and commercial lanes, once a source of pure profit, increasingly required military defense as well. Around 535, before the Common Era, a clash near Corsica signaled how contested these waters were becoming, an early sign that the same sea lanes fueling Etruscan wealth could just as easily become battlefields. The reversal arrived in stages. Etruscan influence in Campania to the south came under growing pressure, and Roman tradition places the end of Etruscan kingship at Rome itself around 509 before the Common Era, a political break at the very city Etruria had once helped shape. Then, in 474 before the Common Era, an Etruscan fleet was decisively defeated off Cumae by Syracuse and its allies, a battle memorialized in a captured bronze helmet later dedicated at the sanctuary of Olympia by the victors. Cumae did not destroy Etruscan civilization. The heartland cities remained wealthy and vibrant. But it marked the moment. Etruria's outward expansion began losing momentum, precisely because success had drawn it into contests it could not always win, and precisely because there was no single unified command capable of absorbing a setback and striking back as one. The years after Cumae did not bring immediate collapse, but they did bring a slow and steady tightening of the strategic map. Etruscan cities in the heartland remained rich, their temples still rising, their artisans still working bronze and terracotta, their tombs still receiving the dead in the old manner. Yet the wider world around them had grown more dangerous on every side. To the south, Cumae had blunted Etruscan reach into Campania, just as Greek maritime power was growing more confident. Internally, many Etruscan cities were also shifting away from monarchy, with power increasingly concentrated in the hands of aristocratic magistrates rather than kings. A political evolution that kept these communities independent of one another, rather than drawing them into any tighter alliance. To the north, groups of Gauls pushed into the Po Valley during the 5th and 4th centuries, striking at Etruscan settlements that had been planted there during the earlier era of expansion. There was a bitter irony in this pressure, since the very expansion that had once carried Etruscan wealth and influence outward. Now, left exposed frontiers on multiple fronts at once, each one requiring resources and attention the city-states could no longer easily spare. The most consequential threat, however, was developing much closer to home. Veii, an Etruscan city situated only a short distance from Rome, across contested borderlands in Latium, found itself locked in a long rivalry with its southern neighbor over territory, control of the Tiber corridor, and regional influence. This was no longer the uneven relationship of earlier centuries, when a young Rome had absorbed lessons and kings from its Etruscan neighbors. Rome had grown into a city with the manpower, political organization, and sheer persistence to wage extended warfare, and it turned that capacity directly against Veii. Roman tradition remembered a siege lasting a full decade, and however much later embellishment shaped that memory, the outcome was undeniable. In 396, before the Common Era, Rome captured Veii, eliminating one of the most important Etruscan city-states, and tearing open a direct pathway into the Etruscan heartland itself. For families living along the old frontier, this was no longer an abstract shift in prestige between distant powers. Farms, roads, and settlements that had once looked toward Veii for protection and authority now fell under Roman control instead, and ownership of land itself began changing hands. Cumae had narrowed Etruria's reach to the south. Gallic pressure had eroded its position in the north, and now Rome, growing steadily stronger at the center of Italy, had proven it could take an entire Etruscan city outright rather than merely raid its territory. The character of the struggle had changed completely. What had once been a story of an expanding, self-confident civilization was now becoming a story of survival. And the fall of Veii proved that Rome's ambitions in Etruria were not a passing border dispute, but the opening move in something far larger. The loss of Veii was not the loss of Etruria as a whole, and there was nothing inevitable about the idea that every remaining city would soon share its fate. Tarquinia, Vulci, Vulcini, Clusium, and other centers still stood, still governed themselves, and still commanded resources and manpower of their own. But Rome no longer needed to defeat all of Etruria in a single decisive war, and this was precisely the danger the old decentralized system now faced. Having gained direct access deeper into Etruscan territory through Veii's fall, Rome continued pressing north through the 4th century before the Common Era, drawing city after city into direct confrontation. Because each Etruscan city-state governed its own affairs, pursued its own interests, and answered to no shared central authority, Rome could fight, negotiate, and settle with each one separately, applying whichever mixture of warfare, treaty, and pressure suited a particular rival at a particular moment. This was not simply a matter of Etruscans failing to unite out of stubbornness. Rome possessed real advantages in manpower, alliances, and institutional adaptability that no single Etruscan city could match alone. But the decentralized structure that had once given Etruria its dynamism now made any sustained, coordinated resistance extraordinarily difficult to organize and even harder to sustain. At times, Etruscan cities did fight alongside broader coalitions, joining forces with Samnites, Umbrians, or Gauls who faced the same expanding threat, transforming the conflict from a purely Etruscan struggle into a contest over who would ultimately shape the future of Italy itself. The scale of that contest became clear at Sentinum, where in 295 before the Common Era, Rome faced and defeated a combined force of Italic and Gallic opponents. Sentinum mattered less as any single ending point, and more as proof that Rome could overcome not just isolated city-states, but entire alliances assembled specifically to stop it. A demonstration that no combination of Etruria's traditional structures could easily reverse. In the decades that followed, Roman control tightened steadily across the region, and by roughly 280, before the Common Era, most, or all of the Etruscan city-states had lost their full political independence, becoming subordinate allies bound to Rome through treaty and obligation rather than free actors in their own right. The old political map received its final blow in 264, before the Common Era, when Rome captured Vulci, one of the last major centers still holding meaningful autonomy, closing out any realistic system of sovereign Etruscan states capable of rivaling Roman power. None of this meant that populations vanished, or that daily life simply stopped. Artisans continued working in their family workshops. Communities continued burying their dead, according to familiar custom. And local sanctuaries kept receiving offerings, much as they always had. What had disappeared first was not the people of Etruria, but their independence. And that distinction would define everything that followed. What came next was not annihilation but absorption, a process that unfolded gradually across roughly 2 centuries, rather than in any single dramatic stroke. Roman roads, colonies, and administrative arrangements steadily wove Etruscan territory into the wider fabric of central Italy, moving soldiers, settlers, goods, and information across a landscape that had once been organized around separate, competing cities. As Etruscan communities became allies and then subjects of Rome, their men increasingly served within Roman military networks, meaning that Etruscan manpower now went to fight wars decided in Rome rather than in their own city councils, a quiet but profound shift in what it meant to belong to an Etruscan community at all. Yet local culture did not disappear the moment political independence did. Etruscan inscriptions, funerary sculpture, stone urns, sarcophagi, and votive offerings continued to be produced for generations after conquest. Clear physical evidence that Roman political domination did not extinguish Etruscan religious and family tradition overnight. Latin, however, carried undeniable practical advantages, since it was the language of Roman administration, the army, expanding trade networks, and eventually citizenship itself. An Etruscan gradually lost ground in daily use as a result, a slow erosion rather than any sudden collapse. Religious and material culture increasingly blurred the line between the two worlds. Archaeologists have identified votive offerings from this period shaped like anatomical body parts left at healing shrines that combine Etruscan and Latin traditions so thoroughly that they are classified as belonging to both traditions at once. Physical proof that communities were worshipping, trading, and living inside a shared cultural space rather than 2 separate ones. The decisive turn came with the social war, fought between 91 and 89 before the Common Era, when Rome's Italian allies, including Etruscan communities, demanded political rights equal to the burdens and service they had long provided. The resulting extension of Roman citizenship pulled Etruscans formally and permanently into the Roman political body, transforming what had been local civic identity into full participation in Roman civic life. A family in the closing years of that century might still carve an Etruscan name onto a funerary monument, even as its members conducted business, served in the army, and exercised legal rights within a world where Latin and Roman law increasingly governed everyday affairs. No new invasion was needed to bring about this transformation. Roads, military service, trade, intermarriage, and law accomplished it instead, one generation at a time. Military conquest had brought Etruria under Roman control, but it was this slower current of daily integration that ultimately dissolved the boundary between conqueror and conquered, turning a once independent civilization into one thread within a much larger Roman fabric. By the final decades of the Roman Republic, Etruscan no longer functioned as an everyday spoken language across most of the region, its practical space steadily displaced by Latin, the language of citizenship, administration, and an empire that now stretched far beyond Italy's shores. No record survives to identify any single last native speaker, because language decline of this kind rarely ends with one dramatic moment. It fades unevenly across households and generations, until it simply stops being renewed. As this happened, one of the clearest outward markers of a distinct Etruscan identity quietly disappeared. Yet the civilization that had conquered Etruria had also spent centuries living beside it, absorbing its urban planning, religious practices, architectural forms, and public symbols long before any final conquest took place. Meaning, Rome carried substantial Etruscan influence within its own culture, even as it erased Etruscan political independence. That influence should not be overstated into a claim that Roman civilization was simply Etruscan in disguise. The debt was real and significant, but selective, filtered through centuries of exchange, rather than wholesale adoption. Because cultural practices do not expire on the same schedule as political states, Etruscan-derived traditions, craftsmanship, and religious expertise persisted well into the Roman period, even after Etruscan cities had lost every trace of formal independence. Meaning, the end of this civilization was best understood as a gradual fade rather than a single closing door. Perhaps the most consequential loss was written rather than political. Almost none of whatever literature the Etruscans once possessed survived into later centuries, a casualty of language decline, broken transmission, and the ordinary unevenness of what history chooses to preserve. Rome, by contrast, left behind an enormous body of its own writing, which is part of why the Etruscans strike modern audiences as mysterious, when the deeper explanation is simply that the surviving evidence is unevenly balanced rather than that this civilization vanished into some unexplainable void. We largely meet the Etruscans today through archaeology, inscriptions, and above all their tombs, rather than through their own written voice. Centuries later, beginning in earnest with Renaissance curiosity and accelerating through the development of modern archaeology, excavators began opening those tombs, cataloguing the bronzes, pottery, and inscriptions inside them, and gradually reconstructing a civilization once known mainly through the writings of Greek and Roman outsiders. Even the old question of Etruscan origins has continued to evolve under modern scrutiny, as ancient DNA research adds direct genetic evidence to a debate long dependent on ancient literary tradition, and the evidence gathered so far supports a picture of strong continuity within central Italy rather than any late, large-scale arrival of population from Anatolia around the time this civilization took shape. A visitor descending into a tomb at Tarquinia today finds banqueters and dancers still painted on the walls exactly as they were, left more than 2,000 years ago. No one speaks their language there anymore, and no independent Etruscan city has stood in that landscape for over 2,000 years. Yet the gestures, the furniture, the clothing, and the rituals captured in that paint remain fully present to anyone willing to look. That is the landscape the story returns to. The quiet streets of Cerveteri's necropolis and the painted chambers of Tarquinia, layered with traces of Villanovan burial, Etruscan city planning, monumental tomb architecture, and centuries of Roman transformation built directly on top of them. The Etruscans became one of the wealthiest and most influential civilizations in pre-Roman Italy, through resources, trade, and a remarkable talent for absorbing outside influence into something distinctly their own. But their strength rested in a network of proud, independent cities rather than any unified state. And as Greek rivals, Gallic migrations, and above all, Roman expansion, pressed in from every direction, those cities lost ground, one at a time, rather than as a single civilization acting together. Rome did not simply defeat Etruria in the end. It absorbed it, folding Etruscan land, manpower, and citizens into its own expanding world. The Etruscans did not vanish in a single catastrophe. Their cities lost their independence, their language slowly faded, and their people became Roman. But Rome itself had already been changed by centuries of living beside them. And something of that older world still lies just beneath the surface of the one it became.